Okay, and welcome to week number 20 of history as we cover the wild, wonderful world of history as it pertains to Western civilization. We're going to start this week off talking about the 30 Years' War. And unlike some others, like the 100 Years' War lasted about 137 years, this one actually lasted right around 30 years, 1618 to 1648. Now, it started off as a battle between the faiths. It was another war bred out of the Protestant Reformation and the Catholic reaction to it, and the Protestant reaction to that. No side was blameless in these wars, certainly. It's sometimes called the last of the religious wars, and it might be the last one where faith was the initial and unquestioned driver behind it. But as you'll see, by the time we get to the end of the 30 Years' War, it had very little to do with religion. And as you'll also discover, there are many other conflicts over the next 5 centuries that, while it might not have been primarily motivated by religion, religion was a strong driving factor. And yeah, just because this was the last religious war, that some people call it, it's not the last time, unfortunately, that people would kill or be killed for their religion. The war is very complicated. This is not just like a we versus they, Protestant versus Catholic, let's do battle on the field, may the best team win. It was really a series of conflicts over 30 years, really 4 major conflicts that we'll get to. And it involved multiple European nation states or small states, so we'll get to that in a second, but it wasn't like Nation A versus Nation B. There were several nations involved in varying degrees in the 30 Years' War. The big driving factor behind it was that old medieval church relic, the Holy Roman Empire. We joked that the Holy Roman Empire was not holy, was not Roman, was not much of an empire. Well, by this point in history, it really was. If you look at the map of the Holy Roman Empire, it occupies mostly modern-day Germany, but the influence, because they were Catholic, extended to those areas which still had very solid Catholic majorities, most notably Spain, and portions of Italy as well. The 30 Years' War, when taken apart from the religious context, would not make much sense. The Holy Roman Empires was ruled by the Habsburg family, one of the most powerful families in Europe over about a 400 or 500 year period. Habsburgs were some real weird folks, though. They did not like marrying outside the family. And so, if you know anything about the genetic process, that led to genetic defects. The Habsburg chin, you'll see in some of these pictures, became a trait of the inbreeding that they had. And this was not an entirely new concept. For a lot of royalty over the years, be they Western or Eastern, the thought of marrying a non-royal was repugnant. And so before they knew about the impact of intermarrying within families, they did it quite freely. Another thing that happens is your mental acuity starts to go down too. So as the Habsburgs were inbreeding, their collective IQ was not getting much better, and of course the people who served under them suffered. The Holy Roman Empire at this point in history included Austria, Bohemia, Franche-Comté, Germany, such as it was then, Lorraine, Luxembourg, Moravia, Switzerland, and part of Hungary. It was a sort of a mishmash of Eastern, what we would call today Eastern and Western Europe. And at the time, again, there was no country named Germany, but there were several duchies and nation states and kingdoms and whatnot that were beginning to form a common ideology beyond the Holy Roman Empire. It was in Bohemia that the 30 Years' War would begin in the year 1618. Bohemia had a history at this point of when the peasants were revolting, they would take the rulers, if they were successful in overturning them, to a third or fourth story window of a building and throw them out, called defenestration, if you're familiar with that. It was seen as a humiliating form of punishment as well. Well, on May 23rd, 1618, a group of Protestant citizens, Protestants, including some Calvinists, were upset that their Catholic rulers were very, very much oppressing them. Again, this was largely a religious issue at this point. In particular, the new king of Bohemia, named Ferdinand II, wanted to close Protestant churches and forbid their members from gathering. So 3 top-ranking town Catholic officials were taken into the tower and thrown out. They all survived, though. Legend has it that they landed in some animal waste, and it was enough animal waste to cushion their fall. That's probably not what you wanted to hear, but anyway. It was called the Defenestration of Prague, and it would spark war for the next 30 years. And again, the spark was, at this point, Protestants versus Catholics. That was the first phase of the 30 Years' War, lasted about 5 years to 1623. After Ferdinand II became king, the Protestants rose up in a revolt because they did not like his policies. They elected their own king named Frederick, a strong Calvinist, and decided he's going to rule us, not you, Mr. Holy Roman Empire dude. Ferdinand II, of course, was more than just the leader of Bohemia. He was a leader of several other regions as well. So it wasn't like you're dethroning a king. You're dethroning a king that rules over many, many kingdoms. So an army of 25,000 men crossed from Austria to Bohemia to try to physically remove Frederick, the people's king, the Calvinist king, led to the Battle of White Mountain, where the Count of Tilly, one of the most accomplished military minds of his time, won that part of the war near Prague. He overthrew Frederick and restored Catholicism in Bohemia. Bohemia is modern-day Czech Republic, just so you'll know where we're talking about here. Had things stopped right there, there might not have been any more to the 30 Years' War, but of course, word got around quickly about the Holy Roman Empire that Ferdinand II was the new emperor of, and they had made it clear they were not going to be tolerant of Protestants. Now, again, both Protestants and Catholics were guilty of bashing each other, so while the Catholics may have sort of pushed this, Protestants are not without blame here. There's plenty of blame to go around. The second phase of the 30 Years' War started at about 1625. This lasted about 4 years. In this case, it was the King of Denmark who acted. His name was Christian IV. He was a strong Lutheran Protestant. Due to the location of his country near the Holy Roman Empire, not in it, he feared that the policies of Ferdinand II would isolate Denmark on their little peninsula north of Germany, and he's right. They couldn't get to mainland Europe without going through the Holy Roman Empire. So Christian IV rose up in arms. He led Denmark's 20,000 men to war, and it did not go well for him. You remember our buddy, the Count of Tilly, one of the great military commanders of his time. Another one was Albrecht von Wallenstein. He was the top commander of the Holy Roman Empire's armies. And so Tilly, who had already squelched the uprising in Bohemia, joined with von Wallenstein to meet this Danish army. And Christian IV simply could not compete with these armies. They were defeated, were the Danes. Christian IV was forced to give up the fight. In order to keep his throne as the King of Denmark, he signed the Treaty of Lubeck in 1629. Once again, the war could have ended there. This could have been the end of it, and it would have been the 11 Years' War. But Ferdinand II, the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, allowed politics to push him further. Evidently, a group of Catholics told him to take back property that had fallen into the hands of the Protestant Lutherans throughout Europe. In what's been called the Edict of Restitution, Ferdinand II formally demanded a great amount of wealth and property be returned to the Church. According to Catholics, it was property that was rightfully theirs. However, this edict went over about like you would expect in the Protestant world. So that leads us to the third phase of the 30 Years' War, involving the Swedish. Now, you would think Sweden, up here north of England and Scandinavia, not directly tied to all this fun that's going on in mainland Europe. What the heck they got to do with anything? Well, at the time, Sweden was led by a very popular and a very powerful king, Gustavus Adolphus. He was called the Lion of the North. Again, very popular with his people. And much like the Danes, he saw the possibility of a Holy Roman Empire that was actively oppressing Protestants would have the same effect on Sweden. It would isolate them eventually. They could not reach any part of mainland Europe without dealing with the Holy Roman Empire. Adolphus, like Christian IV, raised an army. He surmised that his best defense would be a good offense. He meshed together troops of several nations together to build an army of 40,000 men. They were swift and mobile. They used flintlock guns, which were a big advance in weaponry at this point. He also created a strong army by demanding high morals of his men. Women were forbidden to visit the units unless they were wives of soldiers. Every morning and evening was dedicated to prayer. And wherever he conquered, he allowed freedom of religion in his wake. So he did not force his own convictions on others. Way to go, King Adolphus. The Battle of Breitenfeld in 1631, our man Count Tilly's army was hit hard and defeated by the Swedes. So they've gotten much further along than the Danish ever did. Tilly himself was actually injured in that battle. It also left King Adolphus, the Lion of the North, to meet face-to-face with Wallenstein, the other great general, in November of 1632. The face-off occurred at the Battle of Lutzen. King Adolphus had 25,000 men, Wallenstein about 40,000. Wallenstein got a little extra help from Spain. Remember, Catholic, da-da-da-da-da. In the midst of the battle, King Adolphus himself was stabbed and shot and killed. It was a mixed victory because the Protestants did actually carry the day there in terms of the battlefield, but they lost their king, a very strong unifying force. All right, one more phase to go in the 30 Years' War, and it goes to the country of France. At the time, France was being ruled not by a king or a queen, but by a cardinal, very Catholic cardinal, Cardinal Richelieu. That's because the king at this time, Louis XII, I think, was too young to be king. So he was Cardinal Richelieu was acting as a steward of the crown until the king was of age. And he decided to support, this Catholic cardinal decided to support the Protestant armies of the Swedish and the Dutch in their fights against the Holy Roman Empire. Why would a Catholic do that? Well, the best explanation is the war was no longer about religion. It was about the future of free trade and free peoples in Europe. And more, even Catholics saw that the Holy Roman Empire, the way it was now, was not going to be a good fit with basic economic freedom in Europe. Richelieu was devout in his Catholic faith, but he was not vicious towards Protestants. He never tried to take away freedom of worship from the French Protestants, the Huguenots. He was most concerned with the Habsburg family, keeping them in their place. And he thought that there was a very real chance that the Holy Roman Empire could get on the other side of France, ally with Spain, and leave France cut off from the world, basically. As it turned out, though, Ferdinand II's son, Ferdinand III, was not quite as bad as his father was in terms of religious persecution. Again, by this time, the war was not about religion. It was not involving... It had grown to involve Calvinists, Lutherans, Catholics in 6 nations, including Germany, Denmark, Bohemia, Spain, Sweden, and now France. Most of the fighting took place on German soil, or what would be German soil, and that region was really devastated. It led to, eventually, the Peace of Westphalia. The sides decided to get together. Lots of lingering animosities because it took them months just to figure out where everyone was going to sit in the meetings. Evidently, there were some old wounds that had not been healed. They opted instead to meet in two different cities in the state of Westphalia. The French attended both. The meeting took about 3.5 years to finalize. The Peace of Westphalia finally agreed upon in 1648. Almost everyone ended up signing the treaty, except the Pope, of course, and some other unhappy Catholics. The Pope's power in Europe was never the same after this. This was seen by a lot of people, because the Pope was not directly involved in this far-sweeping peace, that the papacy was becoming increasingly irrelevant as far as European politics was concerned. The Calvinists emerged from the treaty, living in the Holy Roman Empire, recognized and given equal rights, same as the Lutherans. So for Calvinists, it justified them. Secondly, Sweden was given control over the mouths of 3 European rivers on the mainland, so that meant they were going to stay in the trade business no matter how powerful the Holy Roman Empire became. And thirdly, France was allotted portions of land to ensure that they also would not be geographically sealed off by the empire. The French gained a lot from this treaty, and it really led to an era of French prominence, which we'll talk about. Of course, all of this underscores, again, that religion was the primary source behind this. And even though by the end of the war it had more to do with power and positioning than religion, you could see where this type of setting would lead to a lot of people being dissatisfied with religion. You can see where it would lead a lot of people to just denounce religion. I mean, if I'm a Catholic, then the Protestants are going to hate me. If I'm a Protestant, the Catholics are going to hate me. Who needs it? You can't really blame somebody for that. It also, though, caused some European adherents' eyes to glance longingly at the New World, a place where they would have religious freedom. And so, as the 30 Years' War was raging on, more and more European settlers, primarily from England, decided that they were going to set up colonies with the number one goal being religious and economic freedom. We've told you about, of course, the Jamestown settlement, the first permanent English settlement. Over the next couple of decades, there were lots of, there were a couple of dozen of British exploratory trips going up rivers and seeing what they could find, scouting out locations. In some instances, making contact with the natives, and even trading to a certain degree. The next real permanent colony came from a group of separatists from the Anglican Church, the Church of England. The community of Scrooby, England, members of this separatist clan were William Brewster, a young boy, a 12-year-old named William Bradford, and John Robinson, who later became a pastor. Because of persecution, they were forced to meet secretly. The members were being spied on day and night, and so they eventually fled England altogether and went to Holland in the Netherlands. Again, they were not much better off there because, as you'll recall, the Dutch people, Protestants, were being very much pressured by the Catholics from Spain. So the separatists found that their time in Holland was not really that much better. And so they started casting eyes towards the New World, and they eventually got a London merchant company to sponsor them in their trip overseas. Now, the London merchants sent some of their merchants with them to make sure their interests were going to be represented. So the ships, there's actually 2 of them at first. Only the Mayflower made it to the New World. The ships were occupied by separatists and strangers. The strangers, of course, being the people hired by the London Mercantile Company to represent their interests, and of course the separatists being the original ones who wanted to get there in the first place for religious freedom. It was an odd mix of Englishmen seeking adventure and new business. They got along very well on the boat headed over. It was about a 2-month journey, and by all accounts, they really, really respected each other and what they brought to the table. The Mayflower carried 30 sailors, 102 pilgrims, only 35 of the Pilgrims were true separatists who actually went to Holland. They picked up a couple of others in Britain. And there were 32 children on board. That's a pretty high percentage. But again, after about 2 months at sea, they finally sighted land. Now, they had planned to go to Virginia, where there was already a charter, of course, Charter of Virginia, the Jamestown colony, but they missed it. They missed it by about 600 miles. They were that much further north. When they saw that they were at much further north, they just said, well, let's go ahead and set it here. And because it was not in Virginia, this is important, there was no law here. The Virginia colony was governed by the Virginia Charter, the Compact. They didn't have that, so they stayed on the boat while scouting out locations where they could take smaller boats to land, and they drew up something called the Mayflower Compact. It was an agreement among all of them that they were to be self-governed, that they were each to do their best according to God's will, that they would protect the rights of others. They elected John Carver as their first governor. If this sounds familiar, that's because you probably read the U.S. Constitution. A lot of these principles that they're pushing for here would find their ways into the Constitution, which is the most unique thing about the United States of America. And again, having experienced the problem of religious persecution in their old world, they didn't want any of that junk in their new world. Interesting here, the separatists, devout though they were, did not try to impose their religion on the strangers, the merchants and whatnot. They were beginning to take baby steps towards what we would call a representative democracy. One of the heroes of the Pilgrims was a guy named Miles Standish. He was a short, stout redhead with a fiery temper. He met the separatists back in Leiden. He never joined the church, but he had great respect for those God-fearing people. The separatists voted him in as the first captain of the colony. They knew that to tame the land, they were going to need someone with a little fire and vinegar. Miles, unfortunately, had some hostile encounters with the Native Americans that ended in bloodshed. The Native Americans quickly learned to leave this little hothead alone. Now, they landed, of course, what's called Plymouth Rock. They called their colony New Plymouth in December 26, 1620, right after Christmas. They set up there. Sits a piece of that rock at Plymouth today to mark the beach landing. The Pilgrims were hard workers. They immediately went about building, hunting, gathering wood. The women had loads of laundry to wash. Even with all their hard work, that first winter was devastating. 42 of the nearly 100 Pilgrims died. At one point, there were only 7 of them healthy enough to tend to the others. One of the healthy ones was Miles Standish, as it turned out. He cooked and cleaned, did whatever he could. In the middle of March of 1621, some of the Pilgrims were hunting one day, and they heard in very broken English the words, "Welcome, Englishmen! Welcome, Englishmen!" Not what they were expecting. They turned around, and it was a Native American named Samoset. According to the Pilgrims, Samoset was a gift from God. He spoke some English, introduced them to 2 very important people. First off, he brought to them a fellow by the name of Squanto. He was a Native American who spoke perfect English. He has an amazing story behind him that we'll tell you more about. He also brought them to their chief, Chief Massasoit. He was a kind Native American chief who was really visiting the region. They were kind of transient at this point too. He was the leader of the Pokanoket Indians. Their legend is that because they occupied the furthest east part, they were the earliest to see the sunrise every morning. Squanto helped improve the relations between the settlers and the natives, and they signed a peace treaty that lasted about 50 years, and the peace treaty really helped the Pilgrims survive their hardships those first couple of years. Governor Carver died in April 1621, just a few months after they settled. And William Bradford got elected to the position and would hold it for the next 30 years. He was the one who came up with the idea of a Thanksgiving, their first Thanksgiving there. And so, yes, unlike so much of other history, we have written accounts of this, of how that first Thanksgiving came to be about, and it's really part of our culture even today. A couple more things about Squanto before we leave here. Remarkable story. He was actually a man caught between the old world and the new. He was born into the Weymouth tribe in what's now modern-day Maine. He was captured or coerced, depending, to go back to England by one of the fur trading groups there, and to be trained on how to be a guide. Now, was he forced to go there? We don't know. We know he was treated well once he was in England. He was well fed, and they were trained to be guides for the Englishmen who wanted to settle later. So he eventually made his way back to England after getting this training. Unfortunately, by the time he came back, he found out his whole tribe had been wiped out by disease. It was 70 some odd people. So he was now a Native American without a home. He had no Indian tribe that he was a member of. Fortunately, there were several Indian tribes that worked with him. And of course, when English settlers started settling in the area, Squanto came in very, very handy. He spoke perfect English, so there was no problem with translation. He made frequent visits to the colonists. He taught them how to better hunt and fish. He taught them how to grow corn, beans, pumpkins. The Pilgrims, again, after getting that first bountiful harvest, thanks largely to Squanto's guidance, sometimes you get help so much, the only thing you can do is throw a party. And that's what they did. Thanksgiving was a party. Unfortunately for Squanto, he died very young, high fever, in the fall of 1623. He died at the age of 38, but really, much like Pocahontas last week, a very fascinating story of someone caught between two very, very different worlds, but who helped us to bridge that gap, one of the initial liaisons between the natives and the settlers. We'll talk more about it on Monday. We'll see you then.